Hey, everybody. Now, I have seen the future, and the men sitting right beside me have built it. I'm excited to introduce the creators of the radically altered user interfaces, their touchless user interfaces, seen in Steven Spielberg's Minority Report and now being used in boardrooms across the world. Please let me introduce Oblong Industries founders, John Underkoffer and Quinn Kramer. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Thank you for not wearing blue.
Thanks you all for coming out.
Yeah.
Now, thanks for sharing your vision with you guys. Yesterday, you invited me to your not-so-secret laboratory, and you shared some of the technologies and gestures and interfaces that you guys have built. Could you tell me a little bit about what you guys have been building?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just to be unfairly reductive about it, I mean, Oblong's mission is to remake the world of computation for the better by putting a new UI, a new user interface on every computer and every screen in the world. And this will be a radically more capable interface by virtue, in turn, I think, of being sort of super fluid, human-centered, high bandwidth in and out of here, and predicated on a fundamental proposition, an axiom of spatial embeddedness.
And so what were some of the specific gestures that you guys showed me yesterday?
Well, a lot of the gestures that we use are the ones that human beings know already. So pointing is centrally important to us. I mean, pointing is that magical human gesture that connects your body to distant space. And when you point, it's for the benefit of someone else who can tell what you're pointing at. So it's important to expose that idea to the machine so that you can refer to distant pixels, distant objects in space.
Now, instead of just talking about it, we want to make sure you guys get a real visceral idea of what these guys are building. So why don't you guys show us a little video? Maybe you could tell us what we're going to see right before.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of blazingly fast welter, a quick montage of a bunch of stuff. But what you'll see is shipping products, custom systems, some prototypes, bits of our core platform, and a few other pieces besides.
Cool, let's roll that video. Pretty cool stuff, huh? So maybe you could describe a few of the gestures that we saw in there. Personally, my favorite is if you're looking through a map and you're in a three-dimensional space and you're zoomed in really close on something, and you're like, wait, where am I? I need more context. You just go like this, and suddenly that's the get me out of here motion, and suddenly you're pulled back out to the outside of the map so you can see everything again. You get your context back. What are some of the other things we saw in there, and maybe what did you find, or what are the gestures that you found to be most natural for people or the most useful?
And Josh, we should say that everything in that video was real. We don't do concept videos at Oblong. We build working software. Some of those things were prototypes. Some of those systems were systems that we've shipped to customers, but every single thing was real. And the stuff you saw last night in our lab was real. And we often talk about what we do as building multi-user, multi-screen, multi-device computing platforms for the future. Our thesis is that there's a huge increase in the number of pixels we all have available to us all the time. Pixels on walls, pixels in devices on desks, pixels in devices we put in our pockets and carry around. And you need to be able to interact with all those pixels in a much more fluid, much more capable way in order to take advantage of the computing horsepower and the graphics horsepower and the networking horsepower we have available. So we've designed the gestural system that's a direct descendant of the work John did for Minority Report that lets you point at any pixel. But you can also use touch on mobile devices and accelerometers in mobile devices and keyboards on mobile devices and web browsers and traditional mice and keyboard to interact with this whole ecosystem. So it's about the gestures, the pointing and the hand poses, but it's also about interacting from every device and every surface that you care about in your world.
That's awesome. Some of the ones I really liked was if you were looking at some photos and you go like this, you'll be scrolling, like skipping to the next photo, and you could go like this and sort of change the distance between your fingers to increase the speed that you're scrolling through things. Stuff that seems really natural once you do it just about once. You see someone do it, and it's like, oh, that's obvious. I don't need a mouse. I don't need to be clicking on a bunch of things. I don't need buttons cluttering up my interfaces. Now, how did you guys come about the idea of this, and how did you get started building these kind of interfaces?
Yeah, we've been at this for 20, 25 years. A lot of us in the early days of Oblong met in the 80s and 90s as students and graduate students at the MIT Media Laboratory, and we were each working on different pieces of what would become the whole Oblong problem. Quinn and I were there, Kevin Parent, Carlton Sparrow, Marianne Norris, Dave Kung, Paul Yaron. We were all sort of, working around the edges of this thing whose convex hull would in fact become Oblong. Quinn, for example, was working on some really beautiful stuff around the idea of network-soluble computation. So a chunk of executing code could, cryptobiotically, like a sea monkey's package, sort of freeze-dry itself, hurl itself across the network, reconstitute, and continue executing on some completely other processor. For myself, I was obsessed. I was fixated on the UI because here's the thing. The UI is all you have. The UI is the computer. And if you've got, in 1984, 512 by 386 pixels and a 1 megahertz processor and one application at a time as the limit, then a keyboard and a mouse or a touch screen or a tablet with a stylus is perfectly adequate. But think about the bandwidth that moves between us when we communicate. The verbal stuff, including prosody and intonation, the physical stuff, and then the way that we interact with our environment. It seems natural, but there's an incredible amount of computation there. Now, if you look at what the machines have done in the meantime, they're actually getting closer and closer, at least in a raw sense, to the processing power here. But we're still trying to talk to them through that really low bandwidth pipe. So our project, the reason we feel like you have to start at the UI is that we got to make that pipe bigger. We got to have high bandwidth communication between ourselves and the machines. And that has to be a collaborative and multi-user proposition as well.
Why do you think it's so dangerous to have user interfaces that really limit, that have a very small, narrow bus between, a computer, which is a brilliant, incredible computer and computational device, and our brains, which are an even greater computational device?
Well, I mean, do you want to get sort of social and political? Because
yes.
Yes. Okay. If that pipe remains small and the pipe is dictated either by commercial necessities or kind of inertia, then what you end up with is a digital version of Orwell's Newspeak, right? Where if you can't say much, then your thought is controlled and your intent is controlled, right? We want the world to be the digital world to be for human beings, and the digital side should react accordingly. It should act as a kind of accomplice or assistant to us. And you just can't do that if all you can do is sort of grunt and click.
Well, we've been shipping systems to customers for 6 years, and what we learned from our early customers who all came to us because they had really big problems and they needed the computers in Minority Report and Iron Man, so they called up the guy who created them. Those customers had big workflow and big data problems, but they weren't IT problems, they were human problems. All of our customers have lots and lots of data, and they have huge amounts of computing horsepower available to them, but actually having human beings apply insight and wisdom to the big data, big workflow problems is an unsolved problem in computing today. We felt like we could solve that problem for customers in real commercial applications like oil reservoir simulation. We built the largest oil reservoir simulation visualization environment for Aramco. That problem matters because the difference between managing an oil reservoir well and managing it poorly is 50 years of sustainable production versus 5 years of sustainable production. That's a human wisdom problem, not an IT problem, even though IT is critical and IT is a bottleneck in a lot of cases. So giving people better tools makes a huge difference in how they do their work. As we often say, that the smartest computer in the room is always in somebody's head in the room. It's never in the AI system in the server closet. Even though the AI system is incredibly valuable, you have to let people work more effectively.
So to be able to envision this kind of thing, you guys need a really long roadmap, right? Like, how far out do you think about when you're building these products? How far are you planning?
Yeah, well, as a company, the project we're talking about, the stuff I described at the beginning, is a 7 to 10 year long project.
And what does that do to the urgency of building products? You know, when you have to ship something just a few months from now, it's easy to tell people you have to stay in the office all night. We really need you to crank and get this done. How do you keep people motivated when they're working on something that's going to be 7 years away and they might feel like, give or take a day is not a big deal?
Well, look, no, our people don't think 7 to 10 years out solely. I mean, we have to get products out. And the fact is, the way you get ideas into the world is through shipping products. So we progressively, deploy fresher and better realized versions of our ideas into the world by shipping products.
And people pay for them, which marks our ideas to market, right? We ship stuff that people pay real money for, and we think that's really important. But the urgency is easy. The bar for working at Oblong is, have you drunk the Kool-Aid? Do you believe this is the way people will use computers in 5, 6, 7 years? And are you obsessed with making that happen? Table stakes are, you're a great programmer, you're a great designer, you're a great hardware engineer, but being passionate about this stuff and not being able to sleep at night and coming into work because you can't get out of your head a naughty UI design problem, that's the bar for coming to work at Oblong.
Yeah, I think that seems like a problem with recruiting right now, is a lot of people are looking for the right person for the job, but not the person who has their heart in the job. And if they're not that committed, if it's not in their soul to get it done, it seems like they might as well just leave after a few years if they just think of it as a puzzle to get finished. Now, what do you guys recommend? Like, what have you learned from using that 10-year roadmap or that 7-year roadmap? How does that inform what you guys are doing next? And do you recommend that to other entrepreneurs?
Absolutely. I mean, I think having your eyes on the distant horizon allows you to navigate much more adroitly as you go along. So it's a 10-year project, but the place you get in 2 years is way further along than the place you would get if you had your eyes on the thing that's 2 years out.
And I think if you think 10 years out, then 6 months becomes easy. Not easy to do. I mean, being in a startup company is hard, building new technology is hard. But if you think 10 years out, then it's easy to figure out what you really should be doing 6 months from now. If you're thinking 6 months out, it's really hard to figure out what you should be doing 2 years from now, I think.
I think that's a really important point to you guys. If you think really far into the distance and you think about a 7 or 10-year roadmap, you're a lot more likely to be able to see 2 years or 6 months very clearly. And I think that's a problem because right now, so many companies, I feel like there's this myopia in the entrepreneurship world right now where everyone is basically trying to build a minimum viable product, get something to market. They're not really thinking about that long term. A lot of teams seem content to just sort of prove themselves and say, maybe I don't know exactly what I want to do, and if I show that my team has talent, then maybe it seems crazy. Now, Paul Graham recently wrote a blog post called Black Swan Farming, and he talked about how the best ideas are sometimes the ones that sit in the intersection, as Peter Thiel told him, between something that is a good idea and sounds like a bad idea. Now, is your approach, would you recommend the 10-year approach to entrepreneurs who want to be one of those black swans, who want to swing for the fences?
Yeah, if you also mark your ideas to market in the short term as well. So that's the tough balance. Think 10 years out, let people tell you you're crazy to want to put a new computer user interface on every screen in the world, and then show them a product.
But when you look at that, does that work with venture capitalists? Are most people like Paul saying that's what they're really shooting for, or does Sand Hill Road, do the venture capitalists, do they jive with that, or are most of them just like, this is not going to happen?
A few do. I mean, there's room clearly in the big ecosystem of venture and startups for work that's everywhere along that temporal spectrum, for 6 months, to product, to 10 years to full realization of idea. We're just hoping that we can get more people at the 10-year end of the thing, because overall, then you end up with a healthier ecosystem. There is, as you say, I think probably a concentration these days down at this end.
If your VCs tell you you can't do something and you believe that you can do it, then find another VC.
I think that's really important. Don't take anyone's word for it if they tell you that you can't do it. Well, yeah, I hope that you guys can bring those insights, and I hope more of the entrepreneurs who are watching or in the audience take that to heart and say, go out there. If you want to build something that requires new hardware 10 years away, build that hardware and think about it from that 10-year perspective, but still build something you can show people in 6 months. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out and telling us about this. Thanks for building the future for us.
Thank you.